The dark personal lives of history's royal families. A sleepy historical monologue about lonely monarchs, family betrayals, strange marriages, and tragic royal lives. Hey guys, tonight we're starting in a place that looks beautiful from the outside. A palace. Tall windows. Golden chandeliers. Silk curtains. Servants moving quietly through endless hallways. The sort of place that appears in paintings and tourist brochures. The sort of place people imagine when they think about wealth, power, and happiness. And yet, if history teaches us anything, it's that palaces are often full of miserable people. Tonight we're exploring the dark personal lives of history's royal families. Not the battles. Not the treaties. Not the glorious victories carved into monuments. We're looking behind the curtains. Into the bedrooms. The dining halls. The family arguments. The lonely corridors where kings wandered in the middle of the night because they couldn't sleep. And honestly, after studying royal history for long enough, you start to realize something very strange. The crowns got bigger. The palaces got larger. The jewels became more expensive. But the family problems remained exactly the same. Except now everyone had armies, which rarely improved the situation. So get comfortable. Maybe turn down the lights. And let's begin our journey through some of the most dysfunctional families in human history. Chapter 1. The family that ruled Rome and destroyed itself. Ancient Rome loved power. Rome loved glory. Rome loved conquest. Rome also had an extraordinary talent for turning family dinners into political disasters. Perhaps no dynasty demonstrates this better than the Julio-Claudian family. From the outside, they appeared unstoppable. They ruled the greatest empire on earth. Their names echoed from Britain to Egypt. Their statues stood in cities thousands of miles apart. Yet behind the scenes, things were considerably less impressive. The family tree looked less like a family tree and more like a collection of personal grudges connected by marriage certificates. At the center stood Augustus, the first Roman emperor. A brilliant politician. A patient strategist. A man who spent decades creating stability after years of civil war. Augustus understood something important. Power is difficult to obtain. Keeping it is even harder. And keeping it inside one family is nearly impossible. Unfortunately, history would prove him correct. His family quickly became a complicated maze of adoptions, political marriages, rivalries, disappointments, and tragedies. Children died young. Potential heirs disappeared. Marriage became a political tool rather than a personal relationship. People rarely married because they loved each other. They married because somebody in government thought it would solve a problem. It usually created new ones. One of Augustus's greatest frustrations involved succession. Who would inherit the empire? The question haunted him for years. Potential heirs kept dying. Others proved disappointing. Some became political liabilities. At times the imperial succession plan seemed less like careful planning and more like somebody repeatedly dropping pieces of a puzzle onto the floor. Eventually the path led to Tiberius. A capable military commander. An intelligent administrator. A deeply unhappy man. And that's where things became darker. Because Tiberius did not seem particularly enthusiastic about becoming emperor. His personal life had already been damaged by politics. The woman he truly loved was taken from him for dynastic reasons. he was pushed into a different marriage designed to strengthen the ruling family. Rome treated royal marriages the way modern corporations treat mergers, as strategic transactions. Human happiness was rarely the priority. And over time, Tiberius grew colder, more isolated, more suspicious, which is perhaps understandable. Imagine spending years surrounded by people who constantly wanted something from you. Power, money, influence, favor. Eventually it becomes difficult to trust anyone. The emperor who ruled the known world increasingly found himself alone. And this pattern would repeat itself again and again across history. Because loneliness might be the most common royal tradition of all. Chapter 2. The Queen Who Could Never Escape Her Bloodline. Several centuries later, in Scotland, another royal family was experiencing its own disaster. This time the central figure was Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary's story begins almost like a fairy tale. A baby queen. Royal blood. A kingdom waiting for her. Unfortunately, fairy tales rarely include armed nobles, religious conflicts, and assassination plots. History does. Mary became queen before she could walk. Which sounds impressive until you realize it meant other people controlled her future from the very beginning. She spent much of her youth in France. The French court was one of the most sophisticated places in Europe. Elegant clothing, music, poetry, art, lavish ceremonies, and endless political intrigue. The last part tended to be unavoidable. Mary grew into an intelligent and cultured young woman. She married the future King of France. For a brief moment, her future looked secure. Then disaster arrived. As it often does in royal history. Her husband died young. Suddenly Mary found herself a widow. Still young. Still important. Still politically valuable. And therefore surrounded by people eager to use her position for their own advantage. Returning to Scotland proved difficult. The country had changed. Religious divisions had deepened. Powerful nobles viewed one another with suspicion. Many viewed Mary with suspicion as well. She was Catholic in an increasingly Protestant kingdom. Every decision she made became controversial. Every relationship became political. And then came Lord Darnley. The marriage quickly turned disastrous. Darnley was ambitious, arrogant, immature. The relationship deteriorated with remarkable speed. The royal household became a battlefield of resentment and mistrust. And eventually Darnley died under circumstances so suspicious that historians are still debating them centuries later. An explosion. A mysterious death. Rumors spreading across Scotland. Accusations flying in every direction. And standing in the middle of it all was Mary. Whether innocent or guilty, she became trapped inside a storm of political suspicion. Soon she lost her throne, lost her freedom, and eventually lost her life. Yet perhaps the saddest thing about Mary's story is not how it ended. It's how little control she ever possessed. She was born into power. Yet her life was constantly shaped by forces outside her control. Family expectations, political rivalries, religious conflicts, dynastic ambitions. She spent her entire life carrying the weight of her bloodline. And eventually it crushed her. Chapter 3. The Romanov family and the end of an empire. Now let's move forward to Imperial Russia. A world of glittering palaces, grand balls, military parades. And beneath all that luxury, a family slowly drifting toward catastrophe. The Romanovs ruled Russia for centuries. By the early 20th century, they seemed permanent, unshakable, protected by tradition and power. History, however, enjoys surprising confident people. At the center stood Tsar Nicholas II. Unlike many rulers, Nicholas was not particularly cruel. He wasn't especially brilliant either. He was, in many ways, an ordinary man trapped inside an extraordinary position. And that may have been the problem. Because ruling the Russian Empire required exceptional political skill, Nicholas often seemed overwhelmed by events. His wife, Alexandra, faced enormous pressure. The royal couple deeply loved their children. Which sounds wholesome. And it was. But their family faced a devastating problem. Their son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a condition that made even minor injuries potentially dangerous. The imperial family lived in constant fear for the boy's health. Every fall, every bruise, every accident could become a crisis. This anxiety transformed the family. They became increasingly isolated, increasingly desperate. And eventually they placed enormous trust in one of history's strangest figures, a mystic named Rasputin. And that, as they say, was not ideal. The dark personal lives of history's royal families. Part 2, Rasputin, the Romanovs, and the family that watched an empire die. Hey guys, welcome back. Last time we left the Russian imperial family in a difficult position, which, unfortunately, was becoming their natural state. The Romanovs possessed enormous wealth, enormous power, enormous palaces, and enormous problems. Because while the outside world saw glittering ceremonies and military parades, the imperial family spent much of their private life worrying about a single child. Alexei, the heir to the throne, the future ruler of Russia, and a boy whose health seemed permanently balanced on a knife's edge. Every bruise was frightening. Every fall was terrifying. Every illness triggered panic. The royal family lived under constant emotional strain. And it was this fear that opened the palace doors to one of history's strangest characters. A man who looked less like a royal advisor and more like someone who wandered out of a forest after arguing with several bears. His name was Rasputin. And if history had casting directors, they would never have dared invent him. Chapter 4. The man who should never have been in the palace. Grigori Rasputin was born in rural Siberia, far away from glittering palaces, far away from aristocratic society, far away from the carefully controlled world of Russian nobility. He was a peasant, a wanderer, a religious mystic, a man surrounded by rumors almost from the beginning. Descriptions of Rasputin vary wildly. Some people considered him holy. Others considered him dangerous. Many considered him deeply unsettling. And honestly, those descriptions are not necessarily contradictory. Rasputin possessed something difficult to explain. Charisma. Not polished charisma. Not charming politician charisma. Not elegant aristocratic charisma. Something stranger. The kind of charisma that makes people either trust you completely or immediately lock their doors. There rarely seemed to be a middle ground. When Rasputin eventually entered royal circles, he attracted attention quickly. Partly because he appeared unusual, partly because he spoke with confidence, and partly because desperate people are often willing to believe extraordinary things. The Romanov family had become desperate. They desperately wanted Alexei to survive. And somehow Rasputin appeared capable of calming the boy during medical crises. Even today historians debate exactly why. Perhaps he genuinely soothed the child. Perhaps he encouraged doctors to avoid harmful treatments. Perhaps coincidence played a role. Whatever the explanation, the results seemed miraculous. And that changed everything. Chapter 5. Alexandra's growing dependence. Of all the Romanovs, nobody trusted Rasputin more than Empress Alexandra. And honestly, understanding why is not difficult. Imagine watching your child suffer repeatedly. Imagine living with constant anxiety. Imagine carrying the knowledge that your son's death could plunge an empire into succession chaos. Then imagine somebody appears who seems capable of helping. Whether that help is real or imagined almost becomes secondary. Hope itself becomes addictive. Alexandra became convinced that Rasputin was protecting Alexei, protecting the dynasty, protecting the future. And gradually she placed enormous trust in him. This created a disaster. Because outside the palace walls, rumors multiplied. Russian aristocrats already disliked Rasputin. Now they hated him. Stories spread through society. Stories about influence. Stories about corruption. Stories about secret meetings. Stories about inappropriate behavior. Many were exaggerated. Some were completely false. But perception matters. Especially during political crises. And Russia was entering one of the greatest crises in its history. Chapter 6. A palace isolated from reality. One of the strangest things about royal families is how easy it becomes for them to lose contact with ordinary life. Imagine spending decades surrounded by servants, protected by guards, living inside enormous residences, receiving information filtered through advisors. Eventually reality begins arriving through layers of interpretation. And that is dangerous. By the early 20th century, the Romanovs increasingly resembled a family living inside a magnificent bubble. Outside the bubble, workers protested. Economic problems grew. Political tensions increased. Revolutionary ideas spread. Inside the bubble, the royal family focused on survival. Family life. Alexei's health. Court ceremonies. Private worries. The emotional worlds of rulers and ordinary people were drifting apart. And when that happens, history becomes unstable. Nicholas II genuinely loved his family. Most historians agree about that. He appears devoted as a husband. Devoted as a father. The problem was that being a good family man does not automatically make someone a successful emperor. History contains many examples of kind individuals who became ineffective rulers. Nicholas increasingly seemed overwhelmed by events. Every crisis demanded decisive action. Every challenge required leadership. Yet he often hesitated, delayed, hoped circumstances might improve on their own. History rarely rewards that strategy. Chapter 7. The beginning of the end. Then came war. World War I. And suddenly every weakness inside the Russian Empire became visible. Military defeats mounted. Economic problems worsened. Food shortages increased. Public frustration exploded. Meanwhile, Nicholas made a decision that would prove disastrous. He left the capital and personally took command of military operations. Now this sounds heroic. And perhaps he intended it that way. Unfortunately, it created a political vacuum. Back in Petrograd, Alexandra became increasingly involved in government. And because Alexandra trusted Rasputin, many people believed Rasputin effectively controlled the empire. The reality was more complicated. But perception again mattered more than facts. Russian society became obsessed with rumors. Rumors about German influence. Rumors about corruption. Rumors about incompetence. Rumors about Rasputin. Every failure strengthened public anger. Every defeat weakened confidence. And eventually some members of the aristocracy reached a dramatic conclusion. They believed Rasputin had to die. Chapter 8. The Murder of Rasputin. Few deaths in history have attracted more myths than the death of Rasputin. The popular version resembles something from a Gothic novel. Poison. Gunshots. Freezing water. A villain who apparently refused to die despite everyone's best efforts. The reality remains difficult to untangle. What we know is that a group of conspirators invited Rasputin to a palace. And there, in December 1916, they murdered him. The conspirators believed they were saving Russia. Removing a corrupt influence. Protecting the monarchy. History had other plans. Because Rasputin was never the true problem. He was a symptom. A symptom of fear. Isolation. Desperation. And a royal family losing touch with the country they ruled. Killing Rasputin solved nothing. In fact, it came too late. Much too late. Within months, the empire itself began collapsing. The fall of the Romanovs. The Russian Revolution arrived with astonishing speed. One moment the Romanovs seemed permanent. The next they appeared fragile. Protests spread. Strikes expanded. Soldiers mutinied. Government authority crumbled. And suddenly Nicholas II faced the unthinkable. Abdication. After more than 300 years of Romanov rule, the dynasty ended. Not with glorious battles. Not with heroic last stands. But with exhaustion. Confusion. And collapse. Nicholas signed away the throne. The emperor became an ordinary citizen almost overnight. Which sounds impossible. Yet history performs these transformations constantly. One day a ruler commands millions. The next day nobody obeys. Power disappears faster than people imagine. The Romanov family entered captivity. At first conditions seemed manageable. Then increasingly restrictive. Then frightening. The future became uncertain. And perhaps the saddest part is that many family members still hoped circumstances might improve. They still hoped rescue might come. They still hoped exile might be possible. History, unfortunately, had become far less forgiving. Chapter 10. The Last Family Dinner. The final months of the Romanovs feel haunting because normal family life continued despite extraordinary circumstances. Parents still worried about children. Children still joked with one another. They read books. Played games. talked, waited, hoped. The world around them had transformed completely. Yet inside their confinement, fragments of ordinary life survived. That may be the most heartbreaking detail. History often focuses on politics, revolutions, governments, ideologies. But at the center of many historical tragedies sits a family. A group of people trying to understand events larger than themselves. And eventually, in July 1918, the Romanovs reached the end of their story. Their deaths marked not merely the end of a dynasty. They marked the end of an entire world. An entire system of monarchy that had seemed permanent for centuries. Gone. Almost overnight. And perhaps that is the strangest lesson in royal history. The palaces seem eternal. The crowns seem eternal. The dynasties seem eternal. Yet eventually every royal family discovers the same truth. Nothing lasts forever. Not power. Not empires. Not even the grandest throne. And in the end, the Romanovs became what so many royal families become in historical memory. A symbol of a vanished age. A family caught between privilege and tragedy. Between luxury and fear. Between unimaginable power and complete helplessness. And honestly, that combination appears again and again throughout history. Because behind every crown is a human story. And human stories are rarely simple. The dark personal lives of history's royal families. Part 3, Henry VIII, his 6 wives, and the family that could never find peace. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're leaving Russia behind and traveling to Tudor England. A world of castles, hunting parties, elaborate feasts, uncomfortable clothing, and enough family drama to keep historians employed for centuries. At the center of this story stands one of the most famous kings in history. A man remembered for power, for ambition, for transformation, and unfortunately for several wives, for making marriage feel considerably more dangerous than it normally should. His name was Henry VIII. And despite what many people remember, Henry did not begin life as a monster. In fact, young Henry seemed remarkably promising. Which makes everything that happened later feel even stranger. Chapter 11. The Golden Prince. When Henry was young, people adored him. He was athletic, handsome, intelligent, educated, confident. The perfect Renaissance prince. At least from a distance. And distance is often where royal reputations look best. His older brother Arthur had originally been expected to inherit the throne. But Arthur died unexpectedly. Suddenly Henry became heir. A single death changed the future of England forever. When Henry became king in 1509, optimism filled the country. The young monarch seemed energetic and capable. He loved tournaments, music, scholarship, sports, celebrations. Everything appeared bright. Everything appeared hopeful. Which is exactly how many historical tragedies begin. Because nobody realizes they're standing at the beginning of a disaster. If they did, they would probably leave. Chapter 12. Catherine of Aragon. Henry's first wife was Catherine of Aragon. And for many years their marriage appeared successful. Catherine was intelligent, respected, politically experienced, strong-willed. She had already endured enormous hardship before becoming queen. Together they seemed stable. At least publicly. Privately, however, a problem haunted the royal family. An heir. Or more specifically, a surviving male heir. Several pregnancies ended in tragedy. Children died. Hope repeatedly collapsed. The emotional toll must have been devastating. Modern people sometimes forget how common child mortality once was. Royal families suffered these losses too. Only their grief unfolded beneath public scrutiny. Every failed pregnancy became political news. Every death became national concern. And as years passed, Henry grew increasingly obsessed with succession. He feared civil war. He feared instability. He feared leaving England without a secure future. Some of these fears were reasonable. Others gradually became personal obsession. Eventually Henry convinced himself that his marriage should end. Catherine disagreed. Strongly. What followed became one of the most famous marital disputes in world history. And honestly, most divorces do not result in religious revolution. But Henry was not most people. Chapter 13. An Bold and Dangerous Ambition. Chapter 13. An Bold and Dangerous Ambition. Anne Boleyn entered Henry's life at exactly the wrong moment. Or perhaps exactly the right moment, depending on perspective. Anne was intelligent, charming, educated, and importantly, she refused to become merely another royal mistress. Henry became fascinated, obsessed, even. Years passed while he pursued her. Meanwhile, his determination to end his marriage intensified. The result transformed England. Unable to obtain the outcome he wanted through existing religious authority, Henry eventually broke with Rome. The English Reformation changed the nation permanently. Countless lives were affected. Religious institutions transformed. Political structures shifted. And underneath this enormous historical change sat something surprisingly personal. A king who desperately wanted a different wife. History can be strangely human sometimes. And eventually became queen. For a brief period she stood at the center of power. Yet royal favor is often fragile. Especially when expectations remain unmet. And gave birth to a daughter. The future Elizabeth I. But not the male heir Henry desired. Gradually the relationship deteriorated. Court politics became dangerous. Enemies gathered. Accusations emerged. And eventually Anne was arrested. The charges remain controversial. Historians continue debating them centuries later. What matters is that Anne lost everything with astonishing speed. One day queen. The next prisoner. Soon afterwards she was executed. And perhaps the most chilling aspect is how quickly court life moved forward. Royal courts rarely pause for grief. There is always another ceremony. Another alliance. Another marriage. History continues moving. Whether people are ready or not. Chapter 14. Jane Seymour and the Cost of Success. After Anne came Jane Seymour. Unlike Anne, Jane appeared quieter. More traditional. Less politically confrontational. And most importantly from Henry's perspective, she gave birth to a son. Edward. At last, the long-awaited male heir. The future seemed secure. The succession problem finally appeared solved. There was just one terrible complication. Jane died shortly after childbirth. The celebration transformed into mourning. And for perhaps the first time in years, Henry experienced genuine personal devastation. Many historians believe Jane may have been the wife he loved most. Not necessarily because their relationship lasted longest, but because she achieved what he desired most and then vanished almost immediately. The king finally received his heir, and lost his wife. The victory felt incomplete, bittersweet, painful, which is another recurring theme in royal history. People often obtain exactly what they want, only to discover the price was far higher than expected. Chapter 15. A family divided. As Henry grew older, something changed. The energetic prince slowly disappeared. Years of political conflict, personal loss, health problems, and absolute power altered him. The king became heavier, more suspicious, less patient, more isolated. Family relationships deteriorated. His daughters Mary and Elizabeth experienced uncertainty and emotional hardship. Political fortunes shifted constantly. One moment they were favored, the next moment marginalized. Royal children often lived inside emotional instability created by adult ambitions. And the Tudor court excelled at creating instability. Imagine growing up never entirely certain whether your position was secure. Never entirely certain who could be trusted. Never entirely certain whether today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy. That was royal life. Not every day, but often enough. And eventually Henry himself approached old age. The powerful king who transformed England began confronting the same reality faced by every ruler before him. Time. The one rival no monarch has ever defeated. Chapter 16. The Lonely King. By the final years of his reign, Henry appeared increasingly isolated. Many old friends were gone. Some had died naturally. Others had suffered less fortunate endings. Court politics continued. But age changes everything. The king who once dazzled Europe now struggled physically. Health problems limited him. Pain followed him. And despite all his power, wealth, and authority, he could not command youth to return. That's one of history's most interesting lessons. Kings can order armies across continents. Emperors can build enormous palaces. Queens can influence entire nations. Yet none of them can negotiate successfully with time. Eventually Henry died in 1547, leaving behind a transformed kingdom, a complicated family, and a legacy that remains controversial even today. Some view him as a visionary ruler. Others see a destructive tyrant. Most historians agree he was both more complicated and more human than either extreme suggests. Because beneath the crown stood a man haunted by fear. Fear of instability. Fear of losing power. Fear of dying without securing his dynasty. Those fears shaped England for generations. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about royal families. Their private anxieties often become public history. A king worries about succession. A nation changes religion. A queen fears betrayal. A war begins. An emperor distrusts advisors. Thousands suffer. The personal and political become impossible to separate. And nowhere is that more obvious than inside royal households. Closing reflection. As we leave Tudor England tonight, one thing becomes clear. royal families rarely enjoyed the peaceful lives people imagine. Behind the portraits stood grief. Behind the ceremonies stood anxiety. Behind the crowns stood ordinary human fears magnified by extraordinary power. Henry VIII spent years searching for certainty, for security, for a lasting dynasty. Yet even after 6 marriages, enormous political changes, and decades on the throne, certainty remained elusive. Perhaps because certainty itself is impossible. Even for kings. Especially for kings. The dark personal lives of history's royal families. Part 4, Marie Antoinette, Versailles, and the family that could not see the storm. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're traveling to 18th century France. A place of glittering chandeliers, endless mirrors, lavish gardens, silk gowns, powdered wigs that appeared large enough to develop their own local government. And behind all this luxury stood one of history's most famous royal families. The Bourbons. Now when people think about royal excess, they often imagine Versailles. And honestly, that's understandable. Versailles was less a palace and more a statement. A gigantic architectural announcement that said, "Look how powerful we are." And for a long time, it worked. The French monarchy appeared untouchable. The king ruled one of Europe's most influential nations. The royal court dazzled visitors from across the continent. Artists admired it. Diplomats envied it. Nobles desperately competed for influence within it. Yet behind the golden walls, family life was often far less glamorous than the paintings suggest. Because royal families, despite possessing unimaginable wealth, remained vulnerable to all the usual human problems. Fear, loneliness, misunderstanding, pressure, and occasionally complete disaster. Chapter 17. A princess leaves home. Our story begins with a young Austrian archduchess, Maria Antonia, the girl who would later become known as Marie Antoinette. She was born into the powerful Habsburg family, one of Europe's most influential dynasties. As a child, she enjoyed a comfortable upbringing. Music lessons, education, court life, family celebrations. The usual activities of an 18th century princess, which, admittedly, were considerably more elaborate than most childhoods. But from an early age, Marie learned a reality common to royal children. Her future did not belong entirely to her. It belonged to politics. Royal marriages were rarely romantic. They were diplomatic agreements disguised as weddings. And when Marie was still very young, plans emerged for her marriage to the future King of France. Suddenly her life changed. She would leave Austria. Leave her family. Leave her childhood. And move to a foreign country where thousands of strangers would judge her every action. Not exactly a relaxing transition. Imagine being a teenager and discovering your future includes representing an international alliance while living under constant public scrutiny. Most people would find that stressful. Marie Antoinette certainly did. Chapter 18. The loneliest palace in Europe. When Marie arrived in France, she entered one of the most rigid court systems in history. Versailles operated according to endless rules. Rules about clothing. Rules about etiquette. Rules about ceremonies. Rules about who could stand where while somebody else got dressed. Which sounds ridiculous. Because it was. The French court transformed ordinary activities into elaborate public performances. Privacy barely existed. Everything carried symbolic importance. Everything had political meaning. And for a young foreign princess, adapting proved difficult. Marie often felt isolated. She struggled with expectations. She missed home. She missed familiar faces. She missed the comfort of family. Yet royal life allowed little room for emotional vulnerability. A future queen was expected to perform confidence whether she felt it or not. And unfortunately, her marriage provided little immediate comfort. Her husband, Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI, was shy, awkward, intelligent in some ways, but socially uncomfortable. Their relationship began slowly. Very slowly. Painfully slowly. For years, rumors surrounded the marriage. The entire royal court became obsessed with the couple's personal life, which must have been deeply uncomfortable. Imagine thousands of people discussing your marriage constantly. Not because they care about your happiness, because they care about international politics. That was royal existence. Chapter 19. Becoming Marie Antoinette. As years passed, Marie gradually adapted. She developed friendships, created social circles, and sought escape from the rigid structure of court life. Unfortunately, some of these efforts damaged her reputation. The young queen enjoyed entertainment, fashion, parties, private gatherings. Nothing especially shocking. But perception matters, especially when you're queen. Every expense became gossip. Every dress became controversy. Every celebration became evidence of supposed irresponsibility. The public image of Marie Antoinette slowly transformed into something she barely recognized. A symbol. A caricature. A target. And once public opinion hardens, changing it becomes nearly impossible. The famous phrase, "Let them eat cake," was almost certainly never spoken by Marie Antoinette. Yet millions still associate it with her. Because stories often survive longer than facts. History can be deeply unfair that way. Chapter 20. The family finally finds happiness. Ironically, just as Marie's public reputation worsened, her private life improved. She and Louis eventually developed a genuine relationship. Not a dramatic romance. Not a fairy tale. But real affection. Mutual trust. Shared family life. Children arrived. The royal couple appeared happiest when removed from court politics. They enjoyed simpler moments. Family meals. Conversations. Time with their children. And perhaps that's what makes their story so tragic. Because behind the political symbols stood actual people. People capable of love. Of worry. Of ordinary family happiness. Yet history rarely allows monarchs to remain ordinary. Especially when nations enter crisis. And France was moving steadily toward crisis. Chapter 21. The Gathering Storm. Throughout the late 18th century, France faced mounting problems. Financial troubles worsened. Government debt expanded. Harvest failures created hardship. Food prices increased. Public frustration grew. And while ordinary families struggled, Versailles remained a symbol of privilege. Whether fair or not, the monarchy became associated with every national problem. Marie Antoinette became the perfect target. She was foreign, visible, famous, and increasingly unpopular. Pamphlets attacked her relentlessly. Rumors spread everywhere. Some accusations were ridiculous, others malicious, many completely invented. Truth became almost irrelevant. The Queen had become a symbol, and symbols attract anger. Meanwhile, Louis XVI struggled with leadership. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't particularly selfish. But he often seemed overwhelmed. Decisive leadership rarely came naturally to him. And unfortunately, historical crises tend to demand decisiveness. The monarchy needed confidence. France received hesitation. Chapter 22. The world begins to collapse. Then came the French Revolution. At first, many people hoped reform was possible. Compromise. Constitutional monarchy. Peaceful change. But revolutions possess momentum. And momentum can be difficult to control. Crowds filled the streets. Political tensions escalated. Old institutions weakened. Authority eroded. Suddenly the royal family found themselves trapped inside events they no longer controlled. One of the most dramatic moments came in October 1789. Thousands of people marched to Versailles. Angry, hungry, determined. The palace that once symbolized absolute power suddenly appeared vulnerable. Very vulnerable. The royal family eventually left Versailles and moved to Paris. Technically, they remained monarchs. In reality, they had become prisoners of circumstance. Their freedom narrowed. Their authority diminished. Their world shrank. Chapter 23. The Failed Escape. Perhaps the saddest chapter began with hope. The royal family attempted escape. They believed leaving Paris might restore stability, might provide safety, might create options. Instead, it created catastrophe. The attempt failed. The family was recognized, stopped, returned to Paris. Public trust collapsed almost completely. The monarchy now appeared disloyal, untrustworthy, disconnected from the nation. Whether these judgments were entirely fair no longer mattered. Politics rarely rewards nuance during revolutions. And from this point onward, events accelerated. Chapter 24. Waiting for the end. The final years feel haunting because of their uncertainty. The royal family waited, watched, hoped, feared. One day brought optimism. The next brought despair. Political factions competed for power. Violence increased. The future remained unclear. And through it all, Marie Antoinette focused increasingly on her children, on family, on survival. The queen who once worried about court etiquette now worried about much simpler things. Safety, health, tomorrow. History has a way of stripping away illusions. The revolution stripped away nearly everything. Titles, privileges, authority, security. What remained was family. And even that would not survive intact. Chapter 25. The Last Queen. Eventually Louis XVI was executed. The king died. The monarchy effectively ended. And Marie Antoinette faced the unbearable reality of continuing alone. Her children were separated from her. Friends disappeared. Supporters vanished. The former queen spent her final months in confinement. The contrast with Versailles could not have been greater. Gone were the chandeliers. Gone were the ceremonies. Gone were the endless courtiers. Only silence remained. And waiting. Lots of waiting. Witnesses described a woman transformed by grief. Exhausted. Thin. Worn down by loss. Yet remarkably composed. Perhaps because there was nothing left to fear. Sometimes courage appears only after hope disappears. In October 1793, Marie Antoinette faced execution. She traveled through Paris in a simple cart. No royal carriage. No ceremony. No grandeur. Just a condemned prisoner moving through streets that once celebrated her arrival as queen. The transformation feels almost impossible. Yet it happened. And that's what makes the story so powerful. Not because it involves royalty. Because it involves impermanence. The realization that everything can change. Sometimes very quickly. Closing reflection. The story of Marie Antoinette and the Bourbon family is often told as a political tragedy. And it certainly was. But it was also a family tragedy. A husband and wife struggling to understand events larger than themselves. Parents trying to protect children during chaos. Human beings trapped inside history. The revolution destroyed a monarchy. But it also destroyed a family. And perhaps that's worth remembering. Because behind every royal portrait stands a real person. And behind every dynasty stands a collection of private hopes, fears, and relationships. The crowns were real. The palaces were real. The power was real. But so were the tears. So was the loneliness. And so was the heartbreak. The dark personal lives of history's royal families. Part 5, The Habsburgs, the family that married itself into trouble. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're stepping into one of the strangest family stories in all of history. A dynasty so powerful that it ruled vast portions of Europe for centuries. A family whose influence stretched across kingdoms, empires, and continents. A family that collected crowns the way some people collect souvenirs. The Habsburgs. Now, if you've never heard of the Habsburgs before, imagine a royal family that became so successful at arranging strategic marriages that they eventually ran out of new relatives to marry. Which, as you might guess, created some problems. Actually, it created many problems. Generations of problems. The sort of problems historians spend entire careers studying. And tonight we're going to explore the strange, lonely, and often tragic personal lives hidden behind one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. Chapter 26. Let others fight wars. The Habsburg family followed a famous strategy. While other rulers fought expensive wars, the Habsburgs preferred marriage. One old saying captured their approach perfectly. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. And honestly, it worked. Remarkably well. Kingdom after kingdom entered Habsburg control through marriage alliances. Spain. Austria. Bohemia. Hungary. Large portions of Europe eventually found themselves ruled by members of the same extended family. From the outside, this looked brilliant. Inside the family, things were becoming increasingly complicated. Because political marriages rarely prioritized emotional compatibility. They prioritized power. And when power becomes the primary goal, family life often suffers. People married for diplomacy, for territory, for succession, for alliances, not necessarily for happiness. And over generations, these decisions accumulated. Slowly, relentlessly, until they produced consequences nobody could ignore. Chapter 27. The Weight of Expectation. One recurring tragedy in royal families is expectation. Imagine being born into a dynasty that controls enormous territories. From your first day, your life belongs partly to politics. Every friendship matters. Every marriage matters. Every child matters. Everything carries dynastic significance. The Habsburg children grew up surrounded by these expectations. Many received excellent educations. Many enjoyed immense privilege. Yet privilege often came with invisible burdens. Young princes knew they would someday represent vast political interests. Young princesses understood they might be sent to foreign courts. Family affection existed. But duty frequently came first. And duty can be exhausting, especially when it never ends. Throughout the dynasty's history, countless family members found themselves trapped between personal desires and political obligations. And politics almost always won. Chapter 28. The Lonely Emperor Rudolph II. One of the most fascinating Habsburg rulers was Rudolph II. Now Rudolph was not obsessed with conquest. He was not obsessed with military glory. He was obsessed with knowledge, art, science, alchemy, astronomy, curious objects, strange collections. And honestly, if he lived today, he might spend an alarming amount of time browsing obscure internet forums about historical mysteries. Rudolph preferred intellectual pursuits to political administration. Which sounds pleasant, unless you're responsible for governing a large empire. Then it becomes problematic. His court in Prague became one of Europe's most fascinating cultural centers. Artists arrived. Scientists arrived. Thinkers arrived. Collectors arrived. Everyone seemed fascinated by Rudolph's interests. Yet despite surrounding himself with brilliant minds, Rudolph often appeared deeply lonely. Many historians believe he suffered from serious mental health struggles. Periods of depression, isolation, paranoia, emotional instability. The emperor gradually withdrew from politics. Increasingly he trusted fewer people. Increasingly he isolated himself. The ruler of a great empire became trapped inside his own thoughts, which is one of history's saddest recurring themes. A person can possess enormous power and still feel profoundly alone. Perhaps especially then. Chapter 29. The family secret nobody could ignore. Now we arrive at a topic that follows the Habsburg story everywhere. Marriage within the dynasty. For generations, Habsburg rulers married relatives. Sometimes close relatives. Sometimes very close relatives. The goal was simple. Keep power within the family. Protect dynastic interests. Maintain political control. On paper, this seemed logical. Biology disagreed. And biology is rarely interested in political strategy. Over time, generations of intermarriage created serious health problems. Physical issues. Medical complications. Reduced fertility. Increasing vulnerability to illness. The most famous example became known as the Habsburg jaw, a distinctive facial characteristic visible in many portraits. At first glance it might seem like a minor curiosity, but it symbolized something much larger. The dynasty had spent centuries prioritizing political calculations over biological reality. And eventually reality presented the bill. History always does. Sometimes centuries later. But eventually. Chapter 30. Charles II of Spain. If one person symbolizes the tragic consequences of dynastic obsession, it is Charles II. Charles inherited the Spanish throne in the 17th century. And from the beginning, his life was difficult. Very difficult. He suffered numerous health challenges. Physical weakness. Developmental difficulties. Chronic illness. Many modern historians believe generations of close family marriages contributed significantly to these problems. Yet despite these struggles, Charles remained king. The ruler of one of the world's largest empires. Think about that for a moment. A man facing enormous personal difficulties while carrying the responsibilities of an entire kingdom. The pressure must have been overwhelming. Court factions surrounded him constantly. Advisors competed for influence. Foreign powers watched carefully. Everyone understood one crucial fact. Charles had no heir. And that meant uncertainty. The future of the dynasty suddenly appeared fragile. Very fragile. Chapter 31. A king surrounded by expectations. Throughout his life, Charles faced expectations he could never fully satisfy. He was expected to rule effectively. Expected to produce heirs. Expected to preserve the dynasty. Expected to maintain Spain's position in Europe. Yet many of these expectations rested beyond his control. Imagine being judged continuously for circumstances you did not create. Imagine carrying the burden of centuries of family decisions. That was Charles's reality. His personal life became a source of constant political anxiety. Every illness generated concern. Every rumor generated speculation. Every year without an heir intensified uncertainty. And as time passed, the future looked increasingly bleak. Chapter 32. The end of a dynasty. When Charles II died in 1700, he left no children. With his death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty ended. Centuries of accumulated power suddenly reached a conclusion. And Europe reacted immediately. The question of succession triggered major international conflict. The War of the Spanish Succession. Once again, a private family issue became a continental crisis. This happened constantly in royal history. A marriage affects diplomacy. A birth affects alliances. A death affects nations. The personal and political remained inseparable. For ordinary people, family disagreements create awkward holidays. For royal families, family disagreements sometimes create wars. The scale differs considerably. Chapter 33. Empress Maria Theresa. Not every Habsburg story ended in tragedy. Some rulers demonstrated remarkable resilience. One of the most impressive was Maria Theresa. She inherited enormous responsibilities during a difficult period. Many European powers questioned her legitimacy. Enemies challenged her authority. Wars erupted. Yet Maria Theresa endured. She governed effectively, raised a large family, maintained influence across Europe, and became one of the dynasty's strongest leaders. Still, even her story contains sadness, because royal motherhood often involved emotional sacrifices. Children frequently left home for political marriages. Daughters became diplomatic tools. Sons carried dynastic expectations. Family affection existed, yet political necessity constantly intervened. Maria Theresa loved her children deeply, but love could not protect them from royal obligations. One of those children would become particularly famous: Marie Antoinette. And as we saw in the previous chapter of our story, that ended tragically. Sometimes even the most powerful mothers cannot protect their children from history. Chapter 34. The Burden of Dynasty. By now a pattern should be emerging. Royal families possessed extraordinary privileges, yet they also carried extraordinary burdens. The Habsburgs ruled vast territories, collected magnificent palaces, accumulated incredible wealth. But behind the grandeur stood ordinary human struggles: loneliness, anxiety, family conflict, health problems, impossible expectations, and perhaps the greatest burden of all, the responsibility of preserving a dynasty. Imagine knowing that generations of ancestors expect you to continue the family legacy. Imagine understanding that your marriage, your children, and even your personal happiness may be secondary to political necessity. That's a tremendous weight for any person, and many Habsburgs spent their lives carrying it. Closing reflection. The story of the Habsburg dynasty reminds us that power rarely solves human problems. Sometimes it complicates them. The family accumulated kingdoms, yet struggled with personal happiness. They mastered diplomacy, yet often failed to create stable family lives. They controlled vast territories, yet could not control biology, time, or fate. And perhaps that's why their story remains so fascinating. Because beneath the crowns stood human beings. Ambitious, fearful, lonely, hopeful, flawed. Exactly like everyone else, only with considerably more portraits and significantly larger palaces. As we continue our journey through history's royal families, we'll discover that this pattern appears again and again. Different countries, different centuries, different crowns, the same human struggles. The dark personal lives of history's royal families. Caligula, Nero, and the imperial families of Rome. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're returning to ancient Rome. A city of marble temples, crowded streets, political ambition, military triumphs, and enough family drama to make every royal court in Europe feel slightly more normal by comparison. And that's saying something. Because Roman imperial families had a remarkable talent for turning personal relationships into public disasters. In most families, an argument at dinner ends with uncomfortable silence. In imperial Rome, it occasionally ended with exile, imprisonment, or a sudden political crisis, which admittedly raises the stakes. Tonight we're exploring two of the most infamous rulers in Roman history: Caligula and Nero. Both men became symbols of imperial excess. Both remain surrounded by legends. And both spent much of their lives trapped inside deeply dysfunctional family environments. Because before they became emperors, They were children growing up in one of the most dangerous families on earth. The Julio-Claudian dynasty. A family where trust was rare, power was everything, and survival itself often felt uncertain. Chapter 35. A childhood surrounded by fear. Caligula was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. A name that sounds extremely important, which, in Roman politics, usually meant trouble. His father, Germanicus, was one of the empire's most beloved military commanders. Handsome, successful, popular. Everything Roman society admired. The public adored him. Soldiers admired him. Even historians generally seemed to like him, which is often a dangerous position in politics, because popularity attracts jealousy. Germanicus died unexpectedly while still relatively young. Almost immediately, rumors appeared. Poison, conspiracy, political enemies. Ancient Romans loved conspiracy theories nearly as much as they loved public spectacles. The truth remains uncertain, but what matters is the effect on the family. Young Caligula grew up surrounded by suspicion. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, believed powerful enemies had destroyed her husband. The family entered conflict with Emperor Tiberius. Soon exile followed. Then arrests. Then deaths. One by one, family members disappeared. The young boy witnessed political terror firsthand. And childhood experiences matter. Even when someone later becomes emperor. Perhaps especially then. Chapter 36. Little Boots. Caligula earned his famous nickname as a child. While accompanying soldiers, he wore a miniature military uniform, including tiny boots. The soldiers found this adorable. Hence the nickname Caligula. Little Boots. It's a strangely cute nickname for someone history would later remember with horror. Imagine if one of history's most feared rulers was permanently known as Tiny Sneakers. The contrast feels absurd. Yet there it is. History occasionally enjoys irony. After years of family tragedy, Caligula eventually found himself living under the watchful eye of Emperor Tiberius. This was hardly a comfortable arrangement. Tiberius trusted very few people. The imperial court had become a world of whispers and suspicion. Every conversation carried risks. Every friendship could become dangerous. Young Caligula learned an important lesson. Survival often required hiding your true thoughts. Ancient writers later claimed he became extraordinarily skilled at pretending. Smiling when necessary. Agreeing when necessary. Waiting patiently. Watching carefully. Learning. And eventually, when Tiberius died in AD 37, Caligula became emperor. The Roman world celebrated. Enthusiastically. For a brief moment, optimism filled the empire. The nightmare seemed over. A young ruler had arrived. Hope returned. Unfortunately, hope can be fragile. Chapter 37. The emperor everyone loved. At first, Caligula appeared successful. Crowds cheered him. Political prisoners received pardons. Public celebrations filled Rome. People believed a brighter future had arrived. And honestly, who can blame them? After years of tension under Tiberius, almost anyone would have looked appealing. But then something changed. Historians still debate exactly what happened. Perhaps severe illness. Perhaps psychological instability. Perhaps the corrupting effects of unlimited power. Maybe a combination of all three. Whatever the cause, Caligula's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. And unpredictability terrifies people, especially when the unpredictable person controls an empire. Suddenly friends became nervous. Officials became cautious. Family members became anxious. Nobody knew what might happen next, which is not an ideal atmosphere for healthy relationships. Chapter 38. Family, Fear, and Absolute Power. One of the saddest aspects of Caligula's reign is how completely fear consumed personal relationships. Family members became potential threats. Friends became potential conspirators. Loyalty became difficult to measure. Trust became nearly impossible. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout royal history. Power distorts relationships. A normal person wonders, does my friend like me? An emperor wonders, is my friend planning my assassination? The emotional consequences are significant. Ancient sources describe Caligula becoming increasingly isolated, increasingly suspicious, increasingly disconnected from reality. Whether every story told about him is true remains uncertain. Roman historians love dramatic storytelling, and many accounts were written decades later. Still, even allowing for exaggeration, a picture emerges. A ruler trapped inside paranoia. A man unable to trust the people closest to him. And eventually, those fears became self-fulfilling. Because when everyone fears you, genuine loyalty becomes rare. Chapter 39. The Sudden End. Caligula ruled for less than 4 years. Then everything ended. In AD 41, members of his own guard assassinated him. Not foreign enemies. Not invading armies. His own protectors. Which tells us something important. The people closest to power often become the most dangerous. Especially when fear replaces trust. The emperor who controlled Rome died surrounded by betrayal. A familiar ending. And certainly not the last time imperial family life would collapse into tragedy. Because waiting in the wings was another ruler whose personal life would become equally infamous. Nero. Chapter 40. A boy named Nero. Nero entered the world through another complicated family story. His mother was Agrippina the Younger, one of the most ambitious women in Roman history. Intelligent, determined, politically skilled, and completely unwilling to remain irrelevant. Agrippina understood power. She understood influence. Most importantly, she understood opportunity. Through careful planning and political maneuvering, she eventually positioned her son to inherit the imperial throne. And remarkably, it worked. Nero became emperor while still very young. At first, things appeared promising. Experienced advisors helped govern. The administration functioned effectively. Public support remained strong. For a brief period, Rome enjoyed stability, which in Roman history often feels suspicious, because stability rarely lasted. Chapter 41. A mother and son at war. The relationship between Nero and Agrippina became one of the most famous family conflicts in ancient history. At first, Agrippina exercised enormous influence. Some contemporary observers believed she effectively governed alongside her son. But influence creates tension, especially when both individuals possess strong personalities. Nero wanted independence. Agrippina expected authority. The result was inevitable. Conflict. Arguments intensified. Political struggles emerged. Supporters chose sides. The imperial family transformed into a battlefield. Again. Because Roman dynasties seemed almost incapable of avoiding this outcome. Eventually Nero viewed his mother as a threat. And once that happened, the relationship became dangerous. Very dangerous. Chapter 42. The boat that wasn't good at being a boat. Ancient historians describe one of history's strangest assassination attempts. According to the story, Nero arranged for his mother's boat to collapse while she traveled. The plan failed. Agrippina survived. Which must have been an awkward development. Imagine organizing a complicated plot involving engineering, timing, and secrecy, only to discover the target successfully swam ashore. History occasionally contains moments of dark absurdity. Eventually, however, Agrippina was killed. And regardless of how events unfolded exactly, the emotional consequences appear significant. Ancient writers describe Nero becoming haunted afterward. Whether by guilt, fear, regret, or political anxiety. Perhaps all of them. The emperor had removed a rival. But he had also destroyed one of the defining relationships of his life. And some actions leave permanent marks. Even on emperors. Chapter 43. The search for applause. Unlike many rulers, Nero desperately wanted admiration. Not merely respect. Not merely obedience. Admiration. Applause. Recognition. He loved music. Poetry. Performance. Artistic expression. Unfortunately, Roman elites considered many of these interests inappropriate for an emperor. Nero wanted audiences. The Roman aristocracy wanted dignity. Neither side received exactly what it wanted. The emperor performed publicly. Crowds attended. And because refusing to attend might seem politically unwise, attendance remained remarkably high. Funny how that works. Yet beneath the performances sat something deeply human. Insecurity. Nero constantly sought approval. And the more approval he sought, the more unstable his position became. Because applause never lasts. Someone always stops clapping eventually. Chapter 44. The lonely end. As Nero's reign progressed, support eroded. Military leaders rebelled. Political allies disappeared. Confidence collapsed. The emperor who once commanded enormous authority suddenly found himself abandoned. Completely abandoned. Ancient sources describe panic, fear, desperation. The ruler who spent years demanding attention discovered something terrifying. When power disappears, many relationships disappear with it. And in AD 68, facing capture, Nero died. His final moments remain among the most famous in Roman history. A lonely emperor. A collapsing regime. A dynasty ending. And perhaps most importantly, a man confronting the reality that applause had never been enough. Closing reflection. The stories of Caligula and Nero are often told as stories of madness and excess. And certainly elements of both exist. But they're also stories about family. About childhood trauma. About isolation. About relationships damaged by power. Because behind every emperor stood a son, a nephew, a family member shaped by experiences long before receiving a crown. And perhaps that's the lesson hidden inside Rome's darkest royal stories. Power amplifies what already exists. Fear becomes paranoia. Ambition becomes obsession. Loneliness becomes isolation. And family conflicts become historical disasters. The imperial palaces of Rome glittered with wealth, but many of the people inside them lived deeply unhappy lives. Which is something we'll continue exploring in our next chapter.